I'm Grace Whitman, 31, and the night I flew back to Oregon, I was still in my blazer from a client pitch that went better than anyone expected, the kind of week that makes you think life is finally leveling out. The plan was simple: swing by my grandmother's house shower, grab the old photo album I promised to bring, and head to the family party by the river. I remember the porch light catching the cedar shingles, the smell of damp earth after a quick spring shower, and the way my key hesitated in the lock like it had stage fright. I tried again, steadier this time, and felt only the stubborn give of a bolt I didn't buy. The street was quiet, my suitcase wheels nudging the step behind me, and somewhere down by the water, a dog barked once and stopped. My phone buzzed in my palm before I could decide whether to knock or laugh this off as a sticky latch. I looked down, saw my mother's name, and felt the ground shift. The message was 7 words long, and it pulled the air right out of my lungs. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. And if you've ever had a door slammed on you by someone you trusted, tap that like and subscribe, so this story finds the people who need it. I grew up learning that home was more than a roof. It was the steady hush of a house that knew your footsteps, a kitchen that smelled like lemon soap and cinnamon on Sundays, and a woman who believed a door should open when you turned the key. My grandmother Margaret taught second graders for 30 years in Riverbend, a small town where people wave from their porches and the river keeps its own slow time. She read me library discards and mended quilts at the dining room table, telling quiet stories about the Whitman women who made do and stood tall and didn't mistake noise for strength. When I was old enough to count change without peeking, she let me ring up the yard sale customers, reminding me that honesty is the only math that works out in the end. Money was tight some years, but kindness was never in short supply. She kept a coffee can for neighbors in a pinch and tucked handwritten notes into recipe books so I'd never forget how to make pot roast the way she did. I took those lessons with me when I left for college, and then for work first to a cubicle, and later to a project manager's desk where numbers moved faster, the coffee was worse, and the stakes felt higher than they should. When Grandma Margaret passed the house by the bend, came to me with the kind of clarity you don't question. The will named me as owner, not because I was the favorite, but because, as she wrote in a letter tucked behind a photo of us at my graduation, I understood what the place was holding. I didn't inherit a fortune. I inherited creaky floors and a roof that needed attention and a porch rail that could snag a sweater if you forgot where the splinters were. I took on the taxes and learned the cost of plumbing the hard way, refinanced my car, and spent weekends with a paintbrush, remembering the exact shade of pale yellow that made the kitchen feel like morning even when the sky was gray. My mother Pat said she was happy for me, proud even, but her smile tightened when I talked about plans, and my brother Brian learned to keep his eyes on his phone when we were in the same room. It's a particular kind of quiet when a family won't say what it means. It spreads thin and sharp into everything. Work pulled me into rooms where people debated budgets and timelines in voices that sounded certain. I got good at solving problems that weren't mine and collecting emails no one wanted to write. It paid the bills and then some, and the house became my balance: rosemary by the kitchen window, mismatched mugs the quilt Margaret made from old dresses, and the sense that I was stewarding something worth more than the value on paper. Riverbend was the old rhythm, my office downtown was the new one. The difference between them was measured in noise and price tags, and the way people greeted you by name or didn't. I moved between those worlds with a kind of practiced grace, always landing at the same front steps, the same chipped mailbox, with my grandmother's handwriting in fading marker. The annual family party, my Uncle Harold's potluck cousins and neighbors, and loud laughter that traveled down the block was the last simple ritual left. I bought a lemon cake from the bakery that knew our order and trusted that some things remained exactly what they looked like. The spring air that night carried rain and cut grass, the kind of clean smell that makes a tired person feel awake. I rolled my suitcase onto the porch, shifted the cake to my left hand, and slid my key into the lock without thinking, because that's how trust works. You don't rehearse it, you just turn and step inside. The metal didn't catch. I jiggled, tried the spare, pressed my shoulder to the door, the way I do in January when the wood swells, and told myself to breathe. New hardware gleamed where my old latch had been. A keypad I never ordered sat where the deadbolt should be. The porch light hummed. A car door clicked somewhere across the street. My shoulder lowered, and I looked at the phone lighting up in my hand. The message from my mother was simple, final, and it waited for me to read it again, as if the meaning might soften the second time around. I stood there on the step. I sanded myself blazer damp at the cuffs, cake box tipping a little to the side, and felt the thin edge of a choice I didn't know I'd have to make, whether to knock to call or to learn what a closed door can teach you. I didn't knock. I stood there on the porch with the smell of wet cedar in the air and my mother's message still glowing on the screen. Locks changed. You have no home. No greeting, no reason, not even a question mark. The words looked like a headline announcing a life that used to be mine. I tried calling her once, then Brian. Both calls went straight to voicemail. Somewhere behind the door I could hear faint music, maybe a radio, or just my imagination trying to fill the silence that used to be filled with Margaret's laughter. My hand tightened around the cake box until the cardboard softened. I placed it on the porch rail, stepped back to the sidewalk, and watched the house that was supposed to be mine sit quiet, lights off, blinds drawn. A part of me waited for the porch light to flicker for someone to open the door and laugh at the misunderstanding. No one did. I got into my car and started driving without knowing where I was headed. The highway opened up under the tires, and every few minutes my phone lit up with nothing. No calls, no texts, just the same 7 words waiting to be read again. I ended up in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner outside Riverbend, the same place Grandma used to take me when we needed pie more than conversation. I sat there for a while, hands still on the steering wheel, trying to remember if I'd said something that could justify this. There wasn't anything. Finally, I called Nina. She didn't ask for details. "Come here," she said, her voice low but firm. I drove across town, and by the time I reached her apartment, the weight in my chest had settled into something too heavy to explain. When she opened the door, I could only manage a whisper. They changed the locks. She wrapped her arms around me and didn't let go. It was the kind of silence that doesn't ask for words, only presence. We sat on her couch, with a blanket pulled around us. The cake box rested on her coffee table untouched. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have. When I finally spoke, the words came out small. She said, "I have no home." Nina shook her head slowly. "That's not just cruel grace. That's planned." I didn't want to believe that yet. I wanted to find some corner of logic that made sense of it, but logic had left with the old lock. I stayed the night on her pull-out couch, awake long after she'd gone to bed. The ceiling fan made a soft, clicking sound every few seconds, and each click felt like a question with no answer. Around dawn, I sat up still in yesterday's clothes and realized I couldn't rest until I saw the house again. Not to argue, not to beg, just to see what had been done. The morning air was cold and sharp. When I turned onto Riverview Drive, the street looked the same trimmed hedges, the neighbor's flag moving in the breeze dew on the mailbox tops. But when I reached my house, something felt off. 3 black trash bags sat by the hedge line near the porch, tied but not tightly, the plastic shining wet from last night's rain. For a moment, I thought they belonged to someone else. Then I saw my grandmother's old teacup print through one of the torn seams. My pulse thudded as I crouched down and untied the first bag. Inside were my clothes folded once, then crumpled, smelling faintly of detergent and damp earth. The second bag held my toiletries, my cracked mug, the one I used every morning for tea. The third hurt most. Books, framed photos, and the small box that once held the silver locket Margaret gave me when I graduated. The box was still there, the chain inside snapped. I stood frozen on the curb, holding the necklace in my palm, unsure if I was supposed to take it or leave it as evidence of something I couldn't name. The street was quiet except for a mail truck a few houses down. No one looked at me. Maybe they'd all been told some story already. I loaded the bags into my trunk one by one, closed it gently, and drove away. There were no tears left, just a clean, cold focus. They wanted silence. I could give them that, but not the kind that meant defeat. At Nina's, I lined the bags along the wall and sat at her kitchen table. My laptop stared back from the counter, waiting. I opened it and pulled up an old folder labeled Collins Fund Docs. The Collins Memorial Fund had been my grandmother's small charitable account, a trust for local nonprofits she loved. After her death, Mom had asked me to manage it temporarily since I worked in finance. I'd kept everything tidy, scanned statements, receipts, emails. At the time, I thought I was helping. Now, scrolling through line after line, I noticed things that didn't add up. Payments to names I didn't recognize, invoices with wrong dates. A contractor listed twice for the same service, same amount. One document stood out a check written to someone named Ryan Callow, who, if memory served, was Brian's old college roommate. He was no consultant. He sold gym memberships in Portland. I kept scrolling. Another invoice was obviously fake wrong font, a logo pulled from an old template. The pit in my stomach deepened. What had looked like sloppiness now looked like something worse. I saved every file to a new drive, renamed it Collins-proof, and backed it up again to the cloud. Then I found a business card in my wallet from a financial law panel I'd attended the year before. Claire Shin, attorney at law. I remembered her as calm, deliberate, the kind of person who saw through noise. I called her office. She answered on the second ring. I explained what happened, the lockout, the text, the bags, the documents. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, her tone stayed even. "What your mother did is called self-help eviction," she said. "That's illegal in Oregon." "You're the recorded deed holder, correct?" I confirmed. "Then we can file for an injunction and re-entry immediately. As for the fund, those records may indicate fraud under a charitable entity. Don't speak to them directly. Let me handle that." The words settled over me like an anchor. For the first time since the porch, something steadied inside me. Claire sent over paperwork within the hour, cease and desist letters, an affidavit for the injunction, and a checklist of what not to do. "Stay calm," she advised. "They'll panic. Don't respond if they reach out. Forward all communication here." I followed every instruction. 2 days later, while I was reviewing documents with her over video call, my phone buzzed with a blocked number. I let it ring twice before answering. The voice on the line was polished, male, practiced. "Miss Whitman, this is Martin Geller. I represent your mother, Patricia, and your brother, Brian." He paused as if expecting surprise. "I gave none. We believe there's been a misunderstanding regarding the Riverbend property," he continued. "My clients are eager to resolve this quietly." His tone was calm, but beneath it something strained. I replied exactly as Claire had coached me. "Please contact my attorney, Claire Shin. She's handling this matter." He tried again, softer now. "I think it would be in everyone's best interest to settle before this escalates." I thanked him politely and hung up. A few minutes later, I received an email from Claire. They reached out. "We're moving forward." The meeting took place 2 days later in a neutral downtown office, all glass walls and gray carpet. Claire and I arrived early. She set her briefcase down, checked the recorder on her phone, and looked at me once. "You don't have to prove anything," she said quietly. "Just tell the truth." I nodded. When the door opened, Mom walked in first, dressed in a blazer too formal for the occasion, her expression tight enough to crack. Brian followed, head lowered, eyes somewhere near the floor. Martin, their lawyer, smiled the kind of smile that costs per hour. They opened with what they called a goodwill offer. They'd return the keys, pay my legal fees, and call the whole thing a misunderstanding on the condition that I sign a non-disclosure agreement and refrain from mentioning the memorial fund to anyone. I let Claire speak first, but halfway through, I felt my own voice return. "No," I said, steady but clear. My mother flinched, like the word had sound she didn't expect. "You changed the locks on a house you don't own. You threw out my things. You told people I betrayed you. That's not a misunderstanding." The room went still. Brian shifted in his chair but didn't look up. Martin cleared his throat. "Then perhaps you'd like to propose terms of your own." I slid a sheet of paper across the table typed that morning, signed by me. It listed every condition Claire and I had agreed upon: full possession of the house, reimbursement for damages, a written public apology, no further claims on the fund, and a permanent no-contact clause regarding the property. My mother's mouth tightened. "You think you can keep us away from our own family home?" "It's not yours," I said quietly. "It never was." Martin scanned the page, then met Claire's eyes. "And if we decline," Claire leaned back in her chair, "then we proceed. My client has evidence of financial misconduct under a charitable fund named after a deceased family member. That landed harder than anything I could have said. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Mom's voice came small but sharp. "You're threatening your own mother." I looked straight at her. "No, I'm setting boundaries." The meeting adjourned soon after their side, asking for time to confer. When the door closed behind them, Claire turned to me with the faintest nod. "You did well," she said. "Now let's make sure they understand you mean it." By the next afternoon, a locksmith and police escort met us at Riverbend. The injunction papers had cleared. My name was printed in bold as the sole legal occupant. As the new lock clicked open, the house exhaled a long, still breath. The rooms beyond were dark, quiet, waiting. I stepped over the threshold, bracing for what I might find. That's when I realized the real damage wasn't the lock itself, it was what might no longer be inside. The locksmith worked the door quietly, while the police officer stood a few steps behind me, arms folded against the early spring chill. The metal gave a small click, and the door drifted open on its hinges, slow and unhurried, as if the house itself were unsure about letting me back in. I stepped inside and waited for the air to settle. The familiar scent of lemon soap and cedar should have been there, but the air smelled faintly of dust and nothing else. Light filtered through half-open blinds, striping the bare floorboards. I took a breath, and the quiet pressed against my ribs like a held note. From the front hallway, I could see what used to be the living room. The copper pots that once hung above the kitchen doorway were gone. The quilt my grandmother hand-stitched years ago was missing from the wall. Every photograph, every knick-knack, every framed memory that gave the space its heartbeat had vanished. The only things left were outlines on the wall, pale rectangles where sunlight hadn't reached. The officer gave a small nod toward the emptiness. "You may want to file a separate theft report," he said gently. "We can't force them to return anything without documentation." I nodded, though the words barely registered. Claire snapped photos in each room, moving methodically, her calm, a quiet counterweight to the hollowness around us. Room by room, I walked through what had once been my home. The dining room table where we used to play cards on rainy nights had been dragged aside, leaving scuff marks across the floor. Even the curtains were gone. Upstairs, the bedrooms were stripped bare. Drawers, empty closet doors open, hangers left like skeletons of what used to hang there. The study, the place I had always felt closest to Margaret, was the hardest. Her desk, the one she'd used to write letters and balance checkbooks by lamplight, was missing entirely. The ceramic owl she used as a paperweight, gone. The silver locket she kept in her drawer with my baby picture inside, gone. I sank into the corner of the room, knees drawn close, not crying, just letting the silence speak for itself. When I finally stood again, Claire was waiting by the doorway, her phone lowered. "They took what they could carry," she said softly. "But what made this house yours isn't gone." I wanted to believe her, but belief doesn't fill a room. We locked up behind us and left the police report in motion. That night, I returned with only a mattress, a sleeping bag, and a few essentials. No furniture, no lights, except the one floor lamp Nina had loaned me. I spread the mattress on the bare wood and lay down, staring at the ceiling where faint outlines of the old chandelier shadows still showed in the paint. The house creaked once as it cooled a sound I hadn't realized I missed until that moment. Morning brought the sound of birds near the window. I made coffee on a borrowed camping stove and drank it sitting on the floor, knees pulled close. The bitterness steadied me. They had taken the house apart, but they hadn't erased the reason it mattered. Margaret's words came back in fragments about resilience, about leaving things better than you found them. I didn't have furniture, but I still had the deed, the injunction, and the one thing no one could sign away the right to start again. That afternoon, I went to the small frame shop on Main Street. The owner, a gray-haired woman named Ruth, greeted me with a nod. I handed her a single photograph, the only one I had saved digitally, Margaret and me, at my college graduation. Her arm looped through mine. I asked for a simple frame. When it was ready, I carried it back and placed it on the mantel where a larger painting had once hung. The photo's reflection caught the light from the window, and for the first time since stepping through the door, the room looked like it remembered something. Days turned into weeks. I painted the kitchen walls a soft yellow, the same shade Margaret used years ago. I planted rosemary and sage along the back fence. Each small act brought the house closer to breathing again. I reached out to a few women I'd met volunteering for a financial literacy program years earlier, retirees, single mothers, women starting over. I told them I had space if they needed a place to meet. "It's nothing fancy," I said, "just a quiet room." They arrived one evening carrying notebooks and thermoses of coffee. We set up folding chairs borrowed from Nina's church, and in what used to be Margaret's parlor, we began talking about credit scores, savings, and rebuilding from loss. The sessions grew slowly. A neighbor dropped off a plate of cookies one night and stayed to listen. Another woman came with her teenage daughter asking for help filling out scholarship forms. Someone else left a handwritten note on my porch. "Your grandmother helped me once. I think she'd be proud of what you're doing here." I pinned it on the refrigerator door. The rooms that once echoed now carried voices again, steady, thoughtful, alive. It wasn't a business. It wasn't charity. It was something in between, a kind of rebuilding that didn't require anyone's permission. Outside Riverbend began to thaw from winter. The air softened, and the lilacs along the porch came back to life. The first afternoon the windows were open, I caught the faintest trace of lemon soap in the air, though I hadn't used any. It could have been memory playing tricks, but I took it as a sign all the same. I bought secondhand rugs from the thrift store, a couch from a neighbor's garage sale, and bookshelves from an estate auction. The house filled up again, not with the same things, but with things that carried new meaning. Work followed suit. My manager called me into a meeting after hearing about the legal ordeal through town gossip. "We want you back on the Miller account," he said. "You've got grit, Grace. Clients notice that." I smiled quietly, grateful for something normal. Nina stayed close through it all, showing up with lamp soup and the kind of easy laughter that keeps walls from feeling too heavy. She never asked if I planned to make peace with my mother. She knew better than to ask. One evening, after everyone had left and the house was finally still again, I walked to the front window. The reflection caught me by surprise. Same brown hair, same tired eyes, but there was something steadier there, too. The mantel behind me glowed in the lamplight, Margaret's photo centered above it. I rested my hand against the wood, tracing the faint scratches that no one had sanded out. "It's mine now," I whispered, not to claim ownership, but to acknowledge responsibility. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of the river through the open window. As the weeks passed, the parlor filled with more stories, women finding their footing, daughters dreaming about college neighbors offering to paint or fix a door hinge. It wasn't about revenge or proving anything anymore. It was about returning life to a place that had been taken apart. I never once heard from my mother or Brian during that time, but silence has its own kind of language. When you stand firm long enough, even quiet becomes a statement. By the time spring folded into early summer, the rooms had warmth again, fresh paint voices, laughter, and the sound of a kettle whistling in the kitchen. The porch steps were newly sanded, the mailbox polished, but still bearing Margaret's faded handwriting. I'd come full circle back to the house, but not the same person who left it. I knew eventually there would be another test, another conversation waiting outside those gates. But for the first time in a long while, I felt ready. The house was whole again, and so was I. And as the sun dipped behind the trees that evening, I understood that even the deepest silence can make room for what comes next. Spring came to Riverbend slowly that year. The mornings were still cool, but the air carried the scent of thawing earth and new growth. Every window I opened let in a small chorus of birds and the rustle of the river a few blocks away. Inside the house had found its rhythm again. Meetings filled the parlor twice a week, voices rising and fading like tidewater. There were charts taped to the walls, mugs lined along the mantel, and small handwritten notes from the women who came. Thank yous, reminders, bits of encouragement. The house that had once stood hollow now hummed with quiet life. I spent those early weeks in motion, fixing, painting, organizing. Routine steadied me. Each small act, washing the floorboards, repairing a cabinet hinge, planting the flower beds, stitched the house back into something living. But even as I worked, I could feel the space where Margaret's desk should have been the one that had always sat under the east window. That corner stayed empty, waiting. One afternoon, I sat there with a cup of tea and realized the house didn't feel like a wound anymore. It felt like a beginning. It was around that time that Claire stopped by with a folder under her arm. She'd driven from Portland after a hearing and wanted to check on me in person. We sat at the small kitchen table while she sorted through paperwork. "The court confirmed your ownership again," she said, sliding a stamped copy of the deed toward me. "And the injunction stands permanently. They can't touch this property." I nodded, tracing the edge of the paper. "What about the fund?" I asked. Claire leaned back, thoughtful. "The investigation's still under review. There's a paper trail we can't ignore, but it's in the hands of the auditors now." "You did everything right, Grace." Her words carried calm certainty, the kind that leaves no space for doubt. After she left, I walked through each room again, noting how sunlight hit the floor at different hours, how the smell of fresh paint mingled with lavender from the garden. The house wasn't just mine anymore. It was a space that held stories, plans, and new beginnings. When the women came for our next meeting, one of them, a retired bookkeeper named Eileen, brought a set of folding chairs she'd found at a yard sale. "These have good bones," she said. "They'll last." We laughed, but she was right. Everything here had to last. We were building something steady out of what had been broken. By midsummer, the gatherings had grown. We weren't just talking about finances anymore. We were sharing resources, connecting people to jobs, helping teenagers apply for scholarships. Nina helped organize an online fundraiser to keep the classes going. The house became more than a meeting space. It turned into a small network of women, supporting one another, the kind Margaret would have loved. One evening after everyone left, I stood in the quiet again, feeling the floor hum faintly beneath my bare feet. It was the first time in months I felt peace deep enough to sit still. The calm lasted until late August, when an envelope arrived without a return address. It was thick, legal-sized, the kind that rarely brings good news. Inside was a letter from Martin Geller, my mother's attorney. The tone was formal, the message simple. "My clients are requesting reconsideration regarding the equitable division of family assets, including property known as 412 Riverview Avenue." I read it twice, then a third time. It wasn't a direct challenge, not yet, but it was the first knock on a door I thought I'd sealed shut. I called Claire immediately. She listened quiet as always. "It's posturing," she said finally. "They want to see if you'll react." "You won't. I'll handle it." Her confidence should have eased me, but that night sleep came hard. The old ache of betrayal surfaced again, softer now, but still there like a bruise that hadn't fully faded. A week later, Nina and I sat on the porch, sharing lemonade, and watching the sunset turn the river gold. "You think they'll try again?" she asked. I shrugged. "Probably, but they're running out of ground to stand on." She nodded slowly, then changed the subject to lighter things, her new job, a neighbor's garden, the local fair coming to town. Still, I could tell she was watching me closely, measuring how deep the worry ran. I didn't want to admit it lingered, but part of me kept waiting for the next move. The days followed their rhythm again. I focused on work on the house, on the women who came to learn and talk. One of them, a young mother named Tara, stopped me after class one night. "I didn't think I could start over," she said quietly, "but this place, it feels safe." Her words caught me off guard. Safety had been the one thing I'd lost completely, and here it was being rebuilt not just for me, but for others. I told her to come back next week, and she smiled for the first time since I'd met her. When she left, I stood by the window for a long time, watching the streetlights flicker on, one by one. As autumn approached, the evenings grew cooler. I started lighting the fireplace again, a small ritual that felt like keeping a promise. The crackle of the wood filled the house with warmth that reminded me of Margaret's winter's books stacked on the table, the smell of cinnamon, and the hum of her radio in the next room. Some nights I still thought of my mother and Brian, wondering if they ever regretted what they'd done. But the thoughts came and went, like passing clouds leaving no mark behind. The house, the women, and the work grounded me in the present. In October, the town hosted its annual Harvest Festival. I volunteered to set up a small booth for our group, offering free budgeting guides and information about scholarships. The response surprised me. People stopped to talk, to share stories, to thank us. Even the mayor stopped by, promising a feature in the local paper. That night, after we packed up, Nina hugged me. "You've turned this into something real," she said, "something people needed." I looked around the town square, lights strung between trees, children running past, and for the first time I felt Margaret's legacy stretch beyond the walls of the house. The next morning, I found a folded note tucked under my front door. The handwriting was familiar, my mother's looping and careful. "We heard about your community work. Grandma would have been proud." There was no signature, no apology, just that one sentence. I left the note on the counter for a long time before moving it to the mantel beside Margaret's photo. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. And that, for now, was enough. That night, as I sat by the fire with the house quiet around me, I realized the silence no longer felt heavy. It was the kind that holds peace instead of pain. The windows reflected soft lamplight, the same kind Margaret used to read by. Outside, the wind moved through the lilacs, brushing against the porch rail she'd once leaned on. I thought about everything that had changed: the locks, the walls, the people, and everything that hadn't the sense of belonging that had always lived here waiting to be reclaimed. I didn't know what might come next, but I knew this much: the house was no longer a battleground. It was home again. And as the fire settled into steady embers, I felt the shift that comes before a new chapter, quiet but certain, like the pause between a breath drawn in and the moment it's finally released. The following weeks moved quietly, a kind of calm that sits over everything after too many storms. The classes at the house had settled into a steady rhythm: Tuesday evenings, Thursday mornings, and the first Saturday of every month. The women came early now, bringing food recipes, even small potted plants for the porch. Tara started helping me with the bookkeeping, and Eileen kept track of attendance in a spiral notebook that used to be my grandmother's grocery list pad. Life had slipped back into something that resembled balance. Then late one afternoon, a knock echoed through the house. I'd just finished cleaning up after a workshop and assumed it was Nina stopping by unannounced, as she often did. But when I opened the door, a man in a crisp shirt and tie stood on the porch holding an envelope sealed with a blue tab. "Delivery for Ms. Grace Whitman," he said. I signed the paper, and before I could ask who sent it, he was already walking back toward a dark sedan idling by the curb. Inside, I broke the seal and unfolded the papers. It was a notice of mediation, formal and unmistakable. My mother and brother were petitioning for equitable redistribution of family assets. They wanted another meeting. For a long minute, I just stared at the letterhead, the ink slightly smudged where my hand had touched it. It wasn't shock this time, more like a confirmation of what I already knew. Some doors never stay closed. I called Claire right away. She answered on the first ring. "I figured this might come," she said evenly. "They're testing how much you're willing to fight." She paused long enough for her voice to soften. "Are you—" "I'm not fighting," I said. "I'm protecting what's already settled. Then we'll make that clear." She asked me to meet her in Portland that weekend to prepare. When Saturday came, I took the early train, the same route my grandmother used to take when she visited relatives years ago. The sky outside was the pale gray of early fall, the fields along the tracks dotted with golden leaves. Claire met me at a corner cafe near her office, all business, but kind enough to ask if I'd eaten. We reviewed the case, the documents, and what she expected would happen. "They don't have a claim," she said, tapping the file. "They're hoping you'll bend out of fatigue. But you're on solid ground, Grace. Don't let their noise shake you." Her calm steadiness grounded me the way it always did. On the ride home, I thought about the pattern of my mother's persistence, the control disguised as concern, the manipulation wrapped in family language. For the first time, I realized I no longer needed to decode her motives. It wasn't about love or fairness. It was about power, and power is something that only holds when you hand it over. The mediation was set for the following Thursday. It took place in a neutral office downtown, a mirror image of the conference room we'd met in months earlier. Claire and I arrived a few minutes before the others. She placed a neat stack of papers in front of her and gave me a brief nod, her way of saying, "We're ready." When my mother walked in, she was dressed in gray again, every detail precise. Brian followed a step behind, looking older than I remembered, tired maybe. Martin was last carrying his leather briefcase like a prop in a familiar performance. The mediator, a calm woman named Karen with silver hair pulled back into a low bun, opened the session. Her tone was measured professional. "We're here to discuss an amicable resolution regarding the Whitman estate and related matters," she said. My mother's lawyer launched into a rehearsed statement about family unity and fair distribution. When he finished, Claire spoke clearly and simply. "My client holds the legal deed as recognized by the court. Any request for redistribution is unfounded." My mother turned to me, then her voice careful but tight. "Grace, you know this house was never meant to divide us. It's supposed to stay in the family." "It is in the family," I said quietly. "I'm the family." Something in her expression flickered hurt pride, anger maybe all at once. Brian avoided my eyes, staring instead at a paperclip on the table. The mediator let the silence stretch before she spoke again. "Is there any room for compromise?" Claire answered for me. "Only if her clients are willing to sign an acknowledgement of ownership and close this matter permanently." Martin leaned back, folding his hands. "My clients would prefer not to escalate further." "Then they should stop," Claire replied, her voice even, but sharp enough to cut through the air. After that, the conversation thinned. The mediator summarized, noting that no agreement could override the standing court order. My mother signed the attendance sheet with a trembling hand, then left without another word. Brian lingered for a moment, his voice low. "I didn't want this," he said quietly. "She did." "I know," I said, "but you went along with it." He nodded once, eyes down, and followed her out. When the door closed, Claire gathered the papers into her bag. "It's done," she said. "They can't keep coming back." Back in Riverbend, the first cold rain of the season arrived. I lit the fireplace that night, the warmth spreading slowly through the rooms. The women still came despite the weather, and our meetings continued under the soft crackle of logs. One evening, Tara brought her little boy, Evan, because his sitter had canceled. He colored quietly at the table while we discussed budgeting for emergencies. When the meeting ended, he handed me a drawing of the house, a square with a red roof and big windows. "This is where the nice ladies go," he said proudly. The picture went straight to the refrigerator door. The days ahead were calm again. The community project kept growing. Local businesses began donating supplies, and a retired teacher offered to host a reading class for teens on weekends. Each time something new took root, it felt like Margaret's hand in all of it. The house had gone from a place of loss to a living network of small, quiet triumphs. One Sunday, as I was pruning the lilac bushes, Nina stopped by with coffee and a grin. "You made the paper," she said, holding up the local Gazette. The headline read, "Riverbend Woman Restores Historic Home into Community Resource Center." The article mentioned my grandmother's legacy, our workshops, and the way the house had come back to life. My name looked strange in print, but not unwelcome. That afternoon the phone rang. The number was blocked. I answered anyway. My mother's voice came through, tentative and careful. "I saw the article," she said. There was a long pause. Then, "Your grandmother would have been proud." It was the same sentence from her note, but this time spoken quieter with something human in it. I didn't know what to say, so I said the truth. "She is." Neither of us spoke after that. The line stayed open long enough for me to hear her sigh before she hung up. That night I walked through each room, lights glowing soft and steady. The mantel held Margaret's photo and the folded note my mother had written weeks before. The walls carried laughter from earlier in the evening, and the faint scent of rosemary drifted from the kitchen window. The house no longer echoed. It listened. I sat by the fire until the embers turned to ash, and the night went still. Outside, the river moved quietly in the dark. The town lights shimmered in its reflection, steady and constant. For the first time in years, I felt something shift inside a stillness that wasn't resignation, but peace. I didn't know what my mother or brother would do next, but it didn't matter anymore. The house had its voice again, and so did I. And as the clock on the mantel ticked softly toward midnight, I realized that the fight was never about ownership or property. It was about something far simpler, who gets to define what home means. The answer finally was clear. The first frost came early that year. Thin sheets of ice glimmered across the flower beds, and the lilac bushes curled under their weight. I woke up one morning to the sound of the old furnace humming again, a reminder that another season had come and gone. The rhythm of the house had become second nature to me now. Morning coffee on the porch, paperwork at the kitchen table, evening classes in the parlor. Each day began and ended in peace, something I hadn't known for years. The program had grown faster than I expected. What started as a handful of women had turned into full sessions every week. Local churches and small businesses began donating supplies. One even offered free childcare during classes, and the community center loaned us a projector for workshops. I didn't call it an organization, but that's what it was becoming, a place where people learned how to rebuild their lives the same way I had learned to rebuild mine. Work at the firm picked up too. My manager called me into his office one afternoon with a grin. "You've got a good eye for stability," he said. "We're assigning you the Clearwater account. It was our biggest client, a portfolio that required precision and trust." I took the file knowing how much faith that meant. For the first time in months, I felt like both parts of my life, the career I'd built and the home I'd restored, had found balance. Still, some nights, I caught myself pausing at the window, half expecting to see headlights pull up or a shadow at the gate. Old habits of worry don't vanish just because peace arrives. But weeks passed, and no one came. My mother's call after the newspaper article had been the last contact. Since then, only silence. A silence that for once felt earned. By late November, the house was glowing again. We held a small Thanksgiving gathering for the women in our group, a gratitude dinner that filled the rooms with warmth and chatter. Eileen brought her famous apple pie, Tara made cornbread, and Nina, never one to cook, brought flowers and her laughter. We ate at long tables set end to end in the parlor, the same space that had once stood empty and stripped bare. When the evening ended, I stayed by the door watching each person leave with their coats and smiles and promises to return. The last to go was Nina. "You did this," she said softly, before stepping out into the cold. After everyone left, I cleaned the last of the dishes and carried a mug of tea to the front porch. The sky was dark, the air crisp enough to see my breath. Across the street, holiday lights had started appearing on rooftops, tiny constellations against the night. I thought about Margaret and how she used to string a single garland around the porch railing every December. She'd always say the same thing: simple light, steady glow. I decided I'd do the same this year. The next morning, I pulled the old storage boxes from the attic. Most of the decorations were gone, taken during the break-in months earlier, but a few had survived the garland, one unbroken ornament, and a set of ceramic angels Margaret used to line on the windowsill. I placed them carefully along the mantel, each one facing slightly outward as if keeping watch. It felt right. The first snow arrived a week later, thin flakes drifting across the yard. I was preparing for our last workshop of the year when a knock sounded at the door. It was mid-afternoon, and I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, Brian stood on the porch. His hands were shoved deep into his coat pockets, and he looked smaller somehow, like someone who'd been walking too long in the cold. "Hey," he said quietly. I didn't answer right away. It had been months since I'd seen him, and the sight stirred a mix of emotions I couldn't name. I stepped aside. "Come in." He hesitated before crossing the threshold, eyes sweeping the room as if to see what had changed. "Looks different," he murmured. "It's supposed to," I said. We sat at the kitchen table. I poured him coffee, the kind of habit that never quite leaves. He didn't touch it at first. "Mom wanted to come," he said finally, "but I told her not to. She's not ready." I waited, letting him find his words. "She's been quiet since that article," he continued. "Says she doesn't understand how things turned out this way. Says Grandma would have wanted her to be part of it." He looked up, then his expression uncertain. "I think she's starting to realize what she did." I didn't respond. There wasn't anything to say that would make the past smaller. Brian leaned forward. "I didn't come to ask for anything. I just wanted to see the house." I studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right." We walked through the rooms slowly. He stopped in the parlor, taking in the folding chairs, the bulletin board covered with schedules and notes, the photo of Margaret on the mantel. "You turned it into something good," he said quietly. "She would have liked that. She believed it should be lived in," I said, "not argued over." He nodded, eyes tracing the details. I was stupid for going along with Mom. I knew it was wrong. The admission hung between us, heavy but real. I felt no satisfaction, only relief that the truth had finally been spoken out loud. When he left an hour later, he paused on the porch. "She'll probably reach out again," he said. "Just be prepared." I told him. The door closed softly behind him, and the sound lingered longer than I expected. For the rest of the evening, I moved through the house, quietly, touching small things, Margaret's photo, the smooth surface of the dining table, the angel figurines on the mantel. It all felt steady, grounded. Whatever came next, I knew where I stood. The following week, I received a call from Claire. "I got a message from Martin," she said. "He says Patricia won't be contesting anything else. The fund audit came back clean, but the irregularities were flagged. She's being advised to close it formally." I thanked her and hung up. The weight that had followed me for nearly a year lifted with that call. For the first time, there were no more battles left to fight, only life to live. In December, I decorated the porch with Margaret's old garland. The lights glowed softly against the snow, their reflection dancing across the river. We hosted a winter open house for the community that weekend, hot cider cookies, a donation jar for next year's programs. The parlor filled with warmth and conversation, laughter, mixing with the crackle of the fireplace. As I stood near the doorway, watching the scene unfold, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, contentment that asked for nothing in return. When the evening ended, I stepped outside, pulling my coat tight. The street was still the snow fresh and untouched. The house behind me glowed through its windows like a living thing. I thought about how far it had come from that day I found the locks changed, how far I had come with it. Somewhere deep in the quiet, I could almost hear Margaret's voice, soft but certain. "You kept it steady, Grace. Simple lights, steady glow." I smiled, then letting the cold air bite my cheeks, the moment sinking in fully. Whatever waited ahead, I knew I could meet it without fear. The house was safe, the work was growing, and the silence that remained was no longer empty. It was peace. The new year was only days away, and with it a sense that something was shifting once more. But this time, it wasn't loss or anger waiting beyond the bend. It was something better, something earned. The new year arrived on a whisper of snow blanketing Riverbend in a soft, quiet white. From my window, the world looked still, almost untouched, as if the chaos of the past year had been tucked away beneath it. The garland on the porch twinkled faintly under the frost, its light reflected in the river below. Inside, the warmth of the fireplace softened every corner of the house. The scent of pine and old wood mingled with something new, hope steady and uncomplicated. The women from our program had taken a short break for the holidays, but messages filled my phone daily. Photos of small victories, a paid-off credit card, a new job, a college acceptance letter. Each one reminded me that what we built here had grown roots deeper than I ever expected. One morning, Eileen called to tell me she'd been invited to speak about our work at the town library's civic luncheon. "They want to know how it started," she said, her voice proud. I told them it began with a house that refused to stay empty. By February, the workshops had expanded beyond Riverbend. The mayor invited me to help organize a county-wide pilot program for financial literacy. Claire handled the legal paperwork, Nina helped draft materials, and the women volunteered to teach. The days were long, but they carried purpose, the kind that steadies you. My grandmother's portrait hung above the mantel, and every time I passed it, I felt her presence, quiet but strong, as though she approved of how far things had come. Still as the town thawed from winter, an unexpected letter arrived in early March. The envelope was thin, the handwriting unmistakable, my mother's. It wasn't legal, not formal, just personal. Inside was a single page written on lined stationery. "I'm sorry for how I handled things. I can't change what I did, but I want you to know I've been thinking about coming by. Only if you'll have me." I read it twice, then set it down beside the teapot. The words didn't undo the years of silence or the pain she caused, but they carried something unfamiliar, humility. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I walked through the house, touching the edges of frames, feeling the warmth in the air, the hum of life that had returned here. Forgiveness, I realized, couldn't be forced. It had to grow on its own quietly, like the lilacs in spring. When the season turned, I planted new flowers along the porch, lavender marigolds and one patch of daffodils that Margaret had loved. Their color rose slowly bright against the weathered steps. One afternoon, as I was watering them, I saw Brian's car slow near the gate. He rolled down the window, hesitant. "She wants to come by next weekend," he said. I told her I'd drive her. I looked past him to the river, its surface shimmering under the sun. "If she does," I said, "make sure she knows I won't reopen old wounds. I can talk, but I won't fight." He nodded. "That's all she wants." The week passed quickly. I prepared without overthinking, tidied the porch, baked a pie, set out tea. When Saturday came, the air was warm, the kind of early spring day that carries both promise and uncertainty. Their car pulled up just before noon. My mother stepped out first, her movements, cautious eyes scanning the house as if expecting it to reject her. Brian stayed close behind but didn't interfere. She paused at the gate, gloved hands gripping the metal, her voice small. "You've done a lot with the place." "It's home," I said simply. We stood there for a beat before I gestured toward the porch. "Come in." Inside, she looked around like she was seeing it for the first time. The parlor was filled with sunlight, the walls lined with bookshelves, and Margaret's photo centered above the mantel. "I didn't think it would feel this way," she murmured. "I thought it would feel different." I poured tea and waited. She took a seat, glancing at the framed newspaper article on the side table. "You've made something people talk about," she said. "Even your uncle called me last month, said you're doing good work." "It's not about recognition," I said. "It's about purpose." She nodded, folding her hands around the cup. "I know I can't fix what happened," she said finally. "When I changed the locks, I thought I was protecting what was left of us. But I see now that all I did was destroy what we had left." Her voice trembled. "I'm sorry, Grace." The words hung between us. For a long time, I said nothing. Then quietly, "You hurt me more than you realize." She looked up, eyes wet. "I know, and I can't forget it overnight." "I don't expect you to," she whispered. We sat in silence after that. No shouting, no arguments, just two women who had once been family, trying to find their way back to something that resembled it. After a while, I stood and handed her a small photo I'd kept tucked inside a drawer, the three of us years ago laughing on this very porch. "Grandma took this," I said. "She'd want you to remember what this place used to mean." My mother traced the edges of the photo with her finger, then looked up at me. "Would it be all right if I came by sometimes to help with the garden, maybe?" I considered it for a moment before nodding. "We'll take it one step at a time." When she left, she stopped on the porch and looked back at the garland still wrapped along the railing. "Simple light, steady glow," she said softly. That was her favorite saying. "She taught it to me," I replied. Her smile was faint but real. "You kept it alive." After they drove away, I stayed outside for a while, watching the road disappear around the curve. The lilacs swayed lightly in the breeze, and the sound of the river carried through the trees. I didn't feel triumphant, just settled, as if a circle that had been left open too long was finally closing. That evening, Nina stopped by with dinner. I told her what had happened, how the visit had gone. She listened without interrupting, then set her hand over mine. "That's the best kind of peace," she said. "The quiet kind." Later, after she left, I sat alone by the window, watching the soft reflection of the garland lights in the glass. The house was warm, steady, alive. It no longer needed defending. And neither did I. I didn't know if my mother's apology would lead to anything lasting, but for the first time, it didn't matter. The need to prove, to justify, to protect it had all fallen away. The house stood strong because it was built on truth now. The night deepened, the river glowed under the moonlight, and somewhere in the distance, a new season waited just beyond reach, one I finally felt ready to meet. The next few months passed in quiet rhythm. Spring melted into early summer, and the house seemed to breathe easier with each sunrise. The workshops continued to grow, drawing not only women from Riverbend, but from neighboring towns as well. What had begun as a handful of chairs in my grandmother's parlor had become something larger, a network of people helping one another find steadiness again. On the mornings before class, I'd walk through the garden, touch the new blooms, and think about how much had changed since the day I stood on that porch with a broken key in my hand. My mother came by a few more times after that first visit, always in the daylight, always unannounced, but never unwelcome. She didn't try to reclaim what was gone or explain the past anymore. Instead, she brought small gestures, a basket of lemons for the kitchen, a clipping from one of Margaret's old rose bushes once thought dead. We spoke mostly about simple things, the garden, the town, the weather. It wasn't forgiveness, not completely, but it was a kind of peace that didn't need words to hold it together. Brian helped her some days trimming hedges or fixing the fence. He never stayed long, but always waved before leaving. I noticed how his visits carried no tension anymore, no guilt clinging to the air between us. Sometimes while he worked, I'd bring him lemonade and we'd stand side by side, quiet but comfortable, two people who had learned the value of distance and the grace in returning when ready. As summer deepened, I felt the house reach a kind of balance, its rooms full, but not crowded, its silence easy. I spent long evenings on the porch with Nina, the two of us watching fireflies blink over the river. She'd tease that the house had finally become what it was meant to be, a bridge between what was lost and what was waiting to begin. She wasn't wrong. The house had held grief, anger, and silence, but now it carried laughter again. It had become a place where stories could start fresh. One evening after a long day of teaching, I found myself alone in the parlor. The windows were open, the last light of day spilling across the floor. On the mantel, Margaret's photo caught the glow, her smile half in shadow, half in sun. I thought about everything that had happened, the locks, the courtrooms, the silence, the rebuilding, and how each step, even the painful ones, had led back to this. The house had survived, and so had I. I sat down in the old reading chair, the one I'd refinished that winter, and watched the reflection of the garland lights in the window. I finally understood what my grandmother meant about steady glow. It wasn't about the brightness of the light, it was about its constancy. The way it stayed, even when no one was looking. The same could be said for love, for dignity, for every quiet choice that rebuilds a life one day at a time. Later that week, the mayor stopped by with a plaque for community service. It wasn't much, a simple wooden frame engraved with the River Bend Initiative for Strength, Integrity, and Hope. I placed it in the hallway near the front door where everyone could see it. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that something good had come from something once broken. On the first anniversary of our program, the parlor filled again, Nina Claire, Tara Eileen, and a dozen new faces who'd found their way here through word of mouth. We celebrated with homemade dishes and stories of the year gone by. At the end of the night, Tara stood up holding her little boy on her hip and said, "We came here because we needed help, but we stayed because we found home." There wasn't much to add after that. Everyone just nodded, and the room went quiet in that way only truth can make it quiet. When the last guest left and the door clicked shut, I turned off the lights one by one. The house glowed softly under the moonlight. Outside, the lilacs swayed against the railing, their scent drifting through the open window. I stood there for a long moment, hands resting on the cool wood of the banister, the sound of the river steady below. I realized then that justice hadn't come from the courtroom or the injunction, it had come from the choice to build to protect what was right without letting bitterness take root. The house had taught me that. Margaret had too. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or land, it's courage. The kind that lets you stand firm when everything familiar is stripped away and still choose grace over vengeance. Before heading inside, I looked back at the porch lights. They glowed just as they always had, soft and certain against the dark. Simple lights, I whispered, steady glow. The words felt like a blessing. If you've ever had to rebuild after being torn down by family, by loss, or by life itself, I hope this story reminds you that you can. Brick by brick, boundary by boundary, you can make peace your home again. And if this story found you tonight, take a moment to breathe, to share it, or simply to hold it close. Because sometimes the quietest stories, the ones built from pain, patience, and persistence, shine the longest once the storms have passed.